Okay, right, let's get started. Lecture 3. Wow. Oh, now hang on, am I not pointing it in the right direction? Here we are. Okay, so just to go through what we did last week, so that we remind ourselves of where we were. We answered, as we're always asking in these lectures, what is causation? And we looked at one possible answer is, could it be counterfactual dependence? And if you remember, counterfactual dependence, E counterfactually depends on C. If had C not occurred, E would not have occurred. So that's counterfactual dependence. And we saw no, if we looked at early preemption. Do you remember Lucy throwing the rock? And we saw that there can be causation without counterfactual dependence. Because Lucy's rock throwing caused the window to shatter, but if Lucy hadn't thrown her rock, the window would still have shattered because Brian would have shattered it. So then we looked at, could causation consist in chains of counterfactual dependence, thereby picking up a question that somebody asked me after the session in the first week, the lady there. So could it be chains of counterfactual dependence? And the trouble there was with trumping. Do you remember the sergeant major? No, did I get that right? No, the major and the sergeant both yelled or ordered advance, and the troops advanced, but of course it was the major's order that called them to advance, not the sergeant's order, because the major trumps the sergeant. And late preemption, where Brian throws his rock so soon after Lucy that there's nowhere that there's a chain of counterfactual dependence leading back to Lucy's rock throwing that isn't there in Brian's rock throwing. So it can't be just chains of counterfactual dependence. And then we looked, if you remember, we looked at the idea of an alternate event, so an event that's different in time or place or slightly in manner from another event. And we see that had Lucy's rock throwing been slightly different, the window shattering would have been slightly different. So, but had Brian's rock throwing been different, the window shattering would have been exactly the same. So it looks as if we can say that it was Lucy's rock that shattered the window, because there's a chain of stepwise influence there that's missing with Brian's rock. And we looked at some objections to this, but all the objections to that seemed to be dealt with by making a distinction between causation and explanation. So if you remember, we looked at, okay, there's a chain of stepwise influences from the campers starting his campfire to the forest fire burning the forest down. But there's also a chain of stepwise influence from the camper's birth to the burning down of the forest. So why should we say that one is the cause when the other isn't? And Lewis says, if you remember, that he holds no truck with these principles of invidious selection. He's not interested in explanation, he's only interested in causation. And yes, it's true that the camper's birth was amongst the causes of the forest fire, the forest burning down, but the one we choose to explain the forest fire burning down is not the camper's birth, obviously, because it doesn't help to make the forest fire intelligible, but the campers lighting the forest fire does help to make the forest fire the campfire does help to make the forest fire intelligible, and therefore we can cite it in an explanation. So there's a difference between two events that are equally causes of the forest fire, but one's an explanation and the other isn't. But we mustn't mistake that for thinking that one is the cause and the other isn't, because they're both causes. But then we looked at whether the counterfactual theory of causation, which is what all of this is, of course, is just a type of regularity theory. And if you remember, we looked at Helen Beebe's claim that actually, because the counterfactual theory of causation rests on the idea of laws of nature, exactly in the way that the regularity theory rests on laws of nature. And in each case, the laws of nature are understood along the Mill-Ramsey-Lewis model, according to which something's a law of nature, a regularity or a description of a regularity, counts as a law of nature if and only if it can be taken out of our best theories of explanation. So interestingly, the laws of nature themselves depend upon intelligibility to us. It looks as if the counterfactual theory of causation is just a version of the regularity theory of causation, which would have caused Lewis's hair to fall out, which would have been interesting given that he's got so much of it. But he thought that his counterfactual theory of causation was a rival to the regularity theory, but it looks as if it might not be. Okay, that's what we did last week. Right, I'm not going to ask for questions of clarification, but I hope there'll be enough time left at the end. If there are any questions, by all means ask them. And you can always email me. People have been emailing me questions, so do email me. Except that, if you email me a question, I will answer it. So beware of my time, because I'm pointing at Mike here, because he sends me reams of questions and then says you don't need to answer them. Okay, so let's look at this week. This week we're going to look at a new interpretation of Hume, so somebody who believes that all these regularity and counterfactual theories that have been derived from Hume's work are actually based on a misinterpretation of Hume. And we're going to look at singularist theories of causation, and I'll explain what they are, of course. We're going to look at the argument for the new interpretation. So we're going to look first at what it is and later at the argument for it. And we're going to look at an ambiguity in the new interpretation, and finally we're going to clarify it. And so we'll leave today with a new interpretation of Hume, but we won't have looked at a version of the new type of theory that will come from it. We'll just be looking at the different interpretation of Hume. Okay. So, the traditional interpretation of Hume that we've already looked at. Hume, on the traditional interpretation, believes that causation is both real and mind independent. He's a realist. The traditional Hume is a realist about causation. He thinks that even if there were no human beings, there would still be events that cause each other. There'd still be causal relations in the world. But he thinks that there's no more to causation than regularity. So what he's saying is that regularities exist independently of us and our minds. So even if we didn't exist, there would be regular events in the universe. There'd be correlations between events of certain types, and therefore there'd be causation whether we're here or not. So whether there's any explanation of any of these events is completely irrelevant. As long as there's causation, there's potential explanation, but if there are no human beings, there's nobody either to explain or to have something explained to them. Let's leave other animals out of this for the moment. Okay, so the traditional Hume is a reductive realist. He's a realist. He thinks that causation is real and mind independent, but he reduces causation to regularity. He thinks that there isn't causation in the individual case. When you see one billiard ball hitting another, there isn't a causal relation there. There's only a causal relation in virtue of the fact that actually when any one billiard ball hits another billiard ball, the second billiard ball will roll off. It's that regularity that's causation. Okay, so what is this new interpretation of Hume? Well, it's again a realist theory, exactly the same way. It believes that causation is real and mind independent. So explanation is a totally different thing. Causation exists whether we exist or not. But it thinks that there might be more to causation than regularity. For example, it might be a power or a force or a necessary connection of some kind. So whereas Hume thinks it's nothing more than regularity, nothing more than correlation, this new interpretation says that Hume allows that there may be necessary connection or a power. So the first billiard balls hitting the second has a power that makes the second roll off. So the new Hume is called a skeptical realist. He's a realist because of this again, and skeptical because he's saying there might be more to causation. Not that there is more to causation, but there might be. And you'll see a bit more later about why we think, why we call this skeptical realism. Okay, so that's the new interpretation of Hume. So the new interpretation of Hume introduces the possibility of a singularist theory of causation, and that's quite different from the two theories of causation, or two versions of the one theory of causation, depending on whether you agree with Helen Beebe or not, that we've already looked at. So let's, according to a singularist theory of causation, which I'm going to call STC because I'm lazy, firstly, causation is not austere, it's not reductive. So Hume thinks there is no causation in the individual case. It's only because we see the correlation that we say that there's causation. And therefore we're denying that there is a power or a force or an intrinsic property in a cause that makes the effect happen. So we're not reducing causation to regularity. Instead, that we're saying causation is a real force of some kind, or is or could be a real force. So it's a real relation between two individual events. When the first billiard ball hits the second billiard ball, there is a force, a power, a necessary connection there, quite independently of anything else that happens, any other case of one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball. So it's present in the individual case. Actually, I'm explaining this all the time. It's really the same point, just in different ways. So we're saying that causation is an intrinsic relation. It's intrinsic to the individual case, not extrinsic to it. So intrinsic means that it would have the property whatever else were the case. So for example, being female is an intrinsic property of mine. Even if the rest of you were to disappear off the face of the earth or have never been born or anything like that, I would still be female. As long as I was left, I'd still be female. It's an intrinsic property of mine. But that I'm taller than average for a woman is not an intrinsic property of mine. It's relative to everyone else, all the other women in the world. Okay, so there are certain properties we have that are intrinsic properties that we'd have whether anything else existed or not. And there are other properties like being 5'6", being a wife, being a husband, that we have only because there are other things. So according to the singularist theory of causation, causation is a property that's an intrinsic, or being a cause is an intrinsic property of the event that causes another effect. And being an effect is an intrinsic property of an effect. You don't need to look at correlations, constant conjunctions, regularities before you can say that there is a cause there. So singularist theory of causation postulates a real connection between cause and effect, not just a real regularity between repeated instances of the type of event instantiated by cause and effect. And if you think about that, there's so one billiard ball hits another billiard ball and cause it to rub off. According to the traditional Hume, you've got to see lots of instances of this before you have a case of causation. It comes in when you've seen these types of event correlated with these types of event. According to the singularist theory of causation, or the new interpretation of Hume, it happens in the individual case. that can be a case of a causal relation. You don't need to have seen more of them. Okay, so a real connection between token events rather than a regularity between types of events. Okay, so the new interpretation of Hume is the brainchild of Galen Strawson. There he is, looking rather younger, I think, than perhaps I might have chosen a more up-to-date one, but there is his book, and that's, you might have an earlier copy of this, I have an earlier copy of this, but that's the book in which he gives the new interpretation. Strawson's argument for the new interpretation is this. He believes that the traditional interpretation slides from the claim that we have no idea of necessary connection, which is an epistemological claim. Can anyone tell me why that's an epistemological claim, not a metaphysical claim?
Because it's how we know it.
Because it's talking about our knowledge of necessary connection. We have no idea of necessary connection. That's a fact about us, okay? Not a fact about the world independently of us, it's a fact about us. So the traditional interpretation slides from this epistemological claim to this metaphysical claim. There is no necessary connection. Now that isn't a claim about us. That's a claim about the world independently of us. It's a claim about necessary connection itself. Can everyone see that that's an epistemological claim and that's a metaphysical claim? And that you cannot go from one to the other, because it could be true that we have no idea of necessary connection, and yet there be a necessary connection, couldn't it? I mean, this is obvious. So it could be true that we have no idea that the Earth is round, but it's still round. So what we think we know about the world, our beliefs about the world, and how the world is, are two separate things. We hope they come together, but they don't necessarily. Okay, so according to Strawson, Hume does make the epistemological claim. He does believe that we have no idea of necessary connection, but he doesn't make and he wouldn't have made the metaphysical claim. So according to Strawson, Hume didn't and wouldn't have said there is no necessary connection. So the metaphysical claim, according to Strawson, goes completely against Hume's confirmed and sceptical belief that we're ignorant of the way the world is independently of our ideas of it. Now Strawson's onto something here. I mean, Hume is a skeptic. He does believe that if there's something that we couldn't know, then that thing may as well not exist. We can only know what we can know, she said rather obviously. But he does claim that as far as the world is independently of our ideas, we can have no idea of it. We can only know the world through our ideas. And if you think about that, that's a very old philosophical idea. I mean, think of Descartes for a second, who wasn't an empiricist by any means. But Descartes pointed out that we can only know the world through our perceptions of the world. We believe that our perceptions of the world are caused by the world, notice, by the world, and that our perceptions are a good guide to how the world is. But actually, how can we know that, given that we can't stand outside our perceptions of the world to see the world as it is in itself, independently of our ideas of it? How could we do that? So Strawson thinks because Hume wouldn't claim anything about what we can know about the world independently of our ideas of it, he would never have made the metaphysical claim, even if he did make the epistemological claim. So the new interpretation of Hume has Hume affirming the possibility, not the actuality, and that's important because Hume is not saying that necessary connection does exist. If he's sceptical about the world, our knowledge of the world independently of our ideas of the world, then the fact we have no idea of necessary connection tells us nothing about necessary connection, does it? It doesn't say that there is necessary connection, but it also doesn't say that there isn't necessary connection, hence the problem with the traditional theory, according to Strawson. So the traditional interpretation of Hume denies even the possibility of necessary connection. It says, it looks as if the argument is exactly the argument that Strawson says it is, that Hume goes from the idea we don't have an idea of necessary connection. If you remember, as far as we're concerned, the one billiard ball might hit another, and the other could turn purple and spin off in the other direction, like the illustration I had in the first case. There's no necessary connection between a cause and its effect. It's not entailed. Okay, so according to Strawson, there are two reasons Hume would have admitted the possibility of necessary connection. That's against the traditional interpretation. Firstly, he thinks that necessary connection is part of our ordinary idea of causation. And Hume was very into the acceptance of our ordinary ideas. He used to, he'd call us the vulgar. Those of us who are not philosophers, he calls the vulgar. But if he thinks that if the vulgar have a certain idea, and it's an idea that's irremovable, that they're going to keep on whatever you say to them, then we've got to pay proper attention to that idea. So induction, for example, the idea that the future is like the past, is an idea that can't be shifted from the way we think, whatever we do. So Hume says, well, we've got to accept that induction exists, while at the same time denying that it's logically justifiable. So if necessary connection is part of our ordinary idea of causation, then we shouldn't just dismiss the idea of the existence of necessary connection. And secondly, I don't know why that happened, Strawson believes that it's implausible to deny the existence of necessary connection. He thinks it's blindingly obvious that there can't be just regularities. There's got to be an explanation for these regularities. Notice the word explanation comes in here again. So how can there just be one billiard ball hitting another and the other rolling off, one billiard ball hitting another and the other rolling off, one billiard ball hitting another and the other rolling? Surely there's got to be an explanation for why this regularity not only exists but is indeed a regularity, and one that we can use to predict and explain and manipulate the world. Okay, so let's have a look at these reasons. Let me stop there for a second and just ask if there are any questions of clarification at this point.
Does it refer back to any particular passages in
In the handout, I've given you all the references. Sorry, I haven't put them on here because I think it's easier to have slides that have as little writing on as possible. But in the handout you'll find all the references to everything. At least I think that, and if there is something that you don't find, just email me and I'll send it to you. Any other questions of clarification at this point? No? Okay, let's carry on looking at reason one. Okay. So the idea, the reason one, if you remember, was that necessary connection is part of our ordinary idea of causation. Well, traditionalists won't deny that. If you remember, they see it, there's Hume's negative argument, do you remember from the first week? So we think that there's necessary connection, but how do we get an idea of necessary connection? Therefore, we've got to explain the idea of necessary connection, but we can explain it away, says the traditional Hume. So traditionalists accept that necessary connection is part of the ordinary idea of causation, but they believe that Hume explained it as a habit of mind projected onto the world. Am I going to explain that? No, okay. So if you remember, Hume said, well, okay, how can we get an idea from lots of instances that we don't get in the first one? Okay, I mean, surely, what if it's missing from the first one, it's missing from all of them, isn't it? And what Hume says, or at least the traditional Hume says, is that when we see this happen and that happen, this happen and that happen, this happen and that happen, it causes us, if we see that again, to expect the second event. And it's that expectation that we project onto the world. So necessary connection doesn't exist in the world independently of us. It's we who project necessary connection onto the world as a result of the habit that forms when we see a constant conjunction. So if we see A and B constantly conjoined, then when we see an A, we're going to expect a B. And it's that expectation that we think is necessary connection. So it's we projecting a habit of ours onto the world. But Strawson argues that Hume's appeal to habit needn't be interpreted as explaining away the idea of necessary connection. Instead, it can be interpreted as signalling that the idea of necessary connection is a relative, not a representative idea. So this is a very important move on Galen Strawson's part. If you remember, Hume is an empiricist. He believes that we can't have ideas without having impressions first. So if you remember, I likened that to we can't have concepts without having percepts first. So we couldn't have a concept of red, for example, unless we'd experienced red. So blind people who can't experience red, they can have a concept of red, but they can't have the same concept that we as normally sighted people have. So their concept of red is going to be parasitic upon our concept of red, because red is a concept of sight. It comes from an impression that comes through sight. That's Hume's empiricism. There's got to be an impression before there's an idea. But what Strawson is saying is that there are two types of idea. There's one type of idea that comes from an impression, that's a representative idea, but there's another type of idea that's a relative idea. So we've got to understand Hume's epistemological claim very carefully. Our idea of necessary connection has no content. It is not a representative idea. There is no impression of necessary connection. We don't look at this and this and this and this and this and this and see a necessary connection and therefore form an idea of what necessary connection is like. Instead, our idea of necessary connection is a relative idea. If you like, and the way we'd put it these days, and the way Hume couldn't have put it, because the idea of a theoretical postulate wasn't around in Hume's time, but it's a theoretical idea. It's an idea of that which lies behind. Theoretical ideas are formed in explanation of our observations and experiences. So we see the tracks in a Wilson clouds chamber and we postulate the existence of atoms. Okay? We see certain observations and we postulate something or other to explain them. So, for example, the Higgs boson, until recently, was an ideal theoretical postulate. Our theories postulated it. What we saw about the world, our observations of the world, enabled us to form a theory which postulated the existence of something that had these properties or this activity, etc. So it's formed in explanation of our observations and experiences, and it's the idea of that which lies behind our experience, the cause, if you like, of what we're experiencing. So can you see that there are these two different ideas? There's our idea of red, which is preeminently a representative idea. My concept of red must have come from an impression. I couldn't have had a concept of red, not the concept I have, any other way than by experiencing redness. But my concept of Higgs boson, or my concept of God, if you like, God is another theoretical idea, is postulated in explanation of the observations that I see. And a theoretical postulate is something that's postulated in order to explain. So Strawson's idea is that, if you like, causation is a theoretical idea, not an idea of, not a representative idea, not a contentful idea. So, according to the new interpretation of Hume, Hume thinks we've got an idea of causation as that which lies behind regularity. So, why do we experience these things in regular succession? Answer, there's some causal relation between each of them which explains why they're always in constant conjunction. So that which lies behind regularity, and you might think of it as the something we know not what. Okay, we don't know what causation is. We only know the effects, if you like, of causation. So we don't know what atoms are exactly. We only know the effects of the atoms when we see the tracks in the Wilson cloud chamber. Okay, any questions at that point? Do you see the distinction between representative ideas and relative ideas or theoretical ideas? David?
Right. Does this argument...
Strawson's argument?
Yes, posit some sort of equivalent between the Higgs boson particle and necessary connection in terms of their explanatory power, because one feels if our eyesight were better, we would be able to see a Higgs boson particle, whereas with a necessary connection, I don't think going to the optician
is going to do
is
it.
going to help much.
Okay, yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Okay, it's true that once you've postulated an entity or a relation that explains something, the next thing you're going to want to do is try and find that entity itself, aren't you? And it's quite true that the Large Hadron Collider is a pretty good example of our faith in our theories of physics, that we will find the Higgs boson, we will be able to see it. The question of whether we'll see whatever it is that causes, whatever it is that lies behind regularity is a very different question. We might, what sort of experiment that we can do, because we might think that there's, as the traditional Hume was, that there's nothing all the way down but yet another regularity. So if we find what explains that regularity, we'll just find another regularity which itself needs explanation, and so on all the way down. So you're quite right. It's very difficult to think of what experiment you might construct that would enable you to find a necessary connection.
I suppose you could just think.
Well, we're going to. I'll say something about that later. So, okay, Bob.
I'm surprised about the traditional interpretation, because Hume says more than once in the inquiry that there could be, there are, it implies there are secret powers which we can't ever find out. We can only look at the regularity. And also, when he talks about getting simpler and simpler, more and more basic laws of nature, regularities, even if we got the ultimate, we wouldn't actually know what caused it all.
Well, the first is an expression of the new interpretation of Hume, and the second is an expression of the old interpretation of Hume. And Strawson makes a lot of the places in Hume where he talks about special powers and so on, and says that this is grist to his mill. But actually, if you are talking about all the way down, then you're talking about the traditional interpretation of Hume.
If you got all the way down, you still haven't really learned.
You still wouldn't have found
something else.
Yep.
But I wonder if people, the traditionalists, think that he was.
But if you won't find anything else, then as an empiricist, he's got to say, well, what good is this something else to us? And again, I'll say something about that later on. Mike?
Just
that's fine.
continuing exactly on Bob's question, there is one point where Hume says something like, yes, of course we can allow for causation to be obvious in a single instance, provided that particular observation can be subsumed under previously observed regularity. Isn't that kind of in-between ground between the old and new?
Well, I mean, I think there's quite a lot. I mean, when you read Strawson, you'll see that he gives lots of places in Hume which he says are grist to his mill, and I find myself quite sympathetic with a lot of what he says. And as I said earlier, how can you, I mean, Hume himself says at one point, how can you see in the multitude of cases what you can't see in one case? That seems to be, causation has got to be there in the individual case, in which case...
No, that's causation as opposed to our knowledge of causation, which is the distinction he's...
Oh, I see, okay.
What I'm trying to ask really is the particular comment of Hume's strikes me as kind of in between the two interpretations, agreeing with neither.
Well, I mean, a lot of what he says wouldn't agree with either, because, of course, actually this two interpretations is something we're imposing on Hume. And he wouldn't have had any theory of theoretical ideas. I mean, we know a lot about theoretical postulates now. I mean, Lewis himself worked very important paper on... can anyone tell me what it's called? I can't remember. Where he talks about theoretical ideas. It is an important paper, and I can't remember what it's called. I'll try and remember to bring it next week. Two more questions, and then I'll move on.
Surely,
if they're fairly quick.
in support of this idea...
The traditional, the new one?
Yes. If you could devise an event that only ever occurs once...
Well, the Big Bang.
For instance, I wasn't going to say that, but yes. Then that supports this idea, because that you would want to find some cause-effect. The Big Bang is not a good idea, but I'm sure you could find an event that occurs only
that occurs only once, and that causes another event that has an effect.
Associated with it.
Yes. But of course, you could still say, had this occurred again, it would have had the same effect, but it didn't. Okay, but Hume's regularity theory would allow that. What he wouldn't allow is that we would know it's a case of causation, because without the regularity there, we can't know that it's causation.
I was just sort of wondering, did Hume consider all causation to be physical causation? Is this always...
Well, that's what we're asking. We're not...
It sort of seems to me that there's a sort of like strangely mystical kind of this. There's something that lies underneath.
There is a mystery here, but the mystery is not mystical. I mean, when we're talking about something that lies behind, we're just... And for example, I postulate beliefs and desires in explanation of your behaviour. Nobody's ever seen a belief or a desire, but they're theoretical postulates. We postulate them in explanation of certain behaviours, and nothing that chair does is...
I mean, so would those two classes... I mean, I would see those as being almost two classes, you know, human activity, cause and effect, and then natural... unthinking activity.
But if you think about a theory is constructed in order to explain certain observations. If you have a theory that says, okay, we see these things, and if we postulate something with these properties as the cause of these observations, this is a theory. And if the theory is a good one, we can now try and search out a little bit more about these things that we're postulating as explanations. So causation is behind all of this. I mean, you don't have a theory that's postulated an explanation. I mean, if you remember...
I'm just wondering if there's if either Hume or, you know, or if any of these people ever consider whether there's different kinds of causation.
Oh, yes.
That's man-made causation, you know. Human causation as a...
Well, I'm going to be talking about mental causation as a very particular type of causation.
Because obviously there's something different to those.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about mental causation the whole of week 6. So, okay. So, what's important in understanding Hume is this. We've got to distinguish the logically unknowable. Locke's, for those of you who are familiar with John Locke, the idea of the something we know not what. So Locke postulated the sort of coat hanger theory of substance. So we never experience extension or substance, space fillingness. All we ever experience is properties that go together, and we might think of objects as bundles of properties. And the substance, why do we think substance exists? Well, it's that in which the properties inhere. So the substance that's a human being is that which carries all the properties of it. But what's the substance itself, and how do we know about this? Is it logically unknowable, i.e. it doesn't itself have any properties? It's just the thing on which properties inhere. Well, why should we postulate something that has no properties? Something that in principle we couldn't experience. Something that in principle is unknowable. That's really very uncomfortable. And it's certainly uncomfortable for an empiricist. Or we could talk about something empirically unknown. Something that science could in principle discover. Okay, do you see the difference there? Difference between something that's logically... I mean, imagine writing a research proposal that you can go off and find something that logic can tell you is unknowable, that it has no properties, there's no way you could recognise it, there's nothing to be discovered. I mean, nobody's going to give you any money. I mean, they probably won't give you any money anyway, but they're certainly not going to give you money for that, and quite right too. Whereas if something's empirically unknown, then that's a different matter entirely, isn't it? That's something, if you can give me a good enough reason to think that this thing exists, even though nobody has yet seen it, then I might give you some money to go and see if you can find it. So Hume, the empiricist, would never have countenanced something logically unknowable. Why should you postulate the existence of something logically unknowable? But the postulation of something empirically unknown is a completely different kettle of fish at all. That we've got to understand. If Strawson's right in his interpretation of Hume, we've got to understand it that way. To understand it in that way would be too big a stretch of Hume's empiricism. Any more questions at that point? No? Okay. So, let's have a look at this idea of causation being something that's empirically unknown. So, we have this theoretical idea of causation. And what we're saying is that causation itself is a relation between events, or whatever it's between. We don't know what it is at the moment. All we know is that it gives rise to regularities between types of events. But what we want to know is what this event is in itself. So in the same way that the Higgs boson, we don't know what it is in itself, but it gives rise to all these things that we observe, and we think we can find it if we look harder or crash some particles into each other hard enough. Okay, let's have a look at this. There are two ways. There's real essence, and there's as a realiser of a functional role. These are two ways we might understand a theoretical idea. So let's have a look at real essence. Okay, the idea of a distinction between real and nominal essence is actually already there in Aristotle. So 500 years BC, a long time ago. But science, for example, discovered that water is H2O. It also discovered that gold has atomic number 79. Well, long before we discovered that water was H2O, we talked about water, we used water, we exchanged confidences about water. we knew what water is. There are people around today who don't know that water is H2O, but water was always H2O, pure water was always H2O. And similarly, there are a lot of people around today who don't know that gold has atomic number 79. But science has discovered that gold does have atomic number 79. That having atomic number 79 is the real essence of gold. So the discoveries that science made here were the discoveries of the real essence of something, the nature of water, the nature of gold, if you like. So in a world in which the colourless potable liquid is not H2O, in other words, it has the same nominal essence, it has all the properties by which we recognise something as water in everyday life. If we actually look at it and it's not H2O, then it's not water. And in exactly the same way, we might find a yellow malleable metal, something with the nominal essence of gold, something that has all the properties by which we recognise gold, but if it's not got atomic number 79, it isn't gold. And I don't know how to tell the difference between something that looks like gold and something that is gold. If it's very important to me to find out whether something's gold or not, I take it to an expert who's able to apply the appropriate tests. And he'll tell me whether it is gold, i.e. whether it has atomic number 79. If it doesn't, it's not gold. End of story. So given that water is H2O and gold has atomic number 79, this is the interesting bit. Water is necessarily H2O. If being H2O is of the essence of water, if this is the very nature of water, and science has discovered that it is, then anything that isn't H2O also isn't water. And ditto with gold. Anything that hasn't got atomic number 79 isn't gold, however much it looks like gold. Okay, so that's real essence. So that's a type of theoretical property, if you like. So natural kinds terms, we look at tigers and we see similarities. Okay, all these animals have this similarity. They all have stripes, they all growl, they all... What else do tigers have? They all look like large cats, etc. But we think that there's a nature that these animals have that explains the similarities. Okay? And this nature will almost certainly be DNA of some kinds. There's tiger DNA that makes something a tiger, and anything that hasn't got that DNA is not a tiger, even if it looks like one. Okay, any questions about real essence? Because I think I'm going on to functional definitions next. Are you all completely bemused? You don't look as if you're totally bemused, you look as if you're really interested. I do hope that is the case. Right. So let's look at functional definitions. Now remember, this is a different way of understanding the idea of a theoretical definition. Science has also discovered that blue objects reflect light at 425 nanometers. Okay, that's something we didn't know before, and it's something that we now know. But this wasn't the discovery of the real essence of blue. I get students who swear blind to me that blue is really the ability to reflect light at 425 nanometers. No, it's not. In a world in which objects appear blue to us, reflect light at 850 nanometers. Now, obviously, that's a different possible world. This is a thought experiment that we're doing. We would still call these objects blue. And that's because the word blue goes along with our experiences, doesn't it? If there was a cosmic change tonight that turned all these chairs in here the colour of... I'm sorry, I don't know your name. I know your father's name.
Dot.
Dot's orange jumper. So all these chairs suddenly looked like that. but they still reflected light at 425 nanometers, would we say they'd changed colour or that they hadn't? So they look like that, but they reflect. If they look like that, have they changed colour? No. No. Who said that? Go on, why not?
Because what we call blue is what blue seems to us.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were disagreeing with me. Yes, they haven't. They have changed colour if they look like that. You should be saying yes, not no.
I may have misunderstood the question, but essentially, whatever wavelength of light they reflect is irrelevant.
Irrelevant.
So is the experience we have of the chair.
Exactly. Yep, that's what I'm claiming too. So if the chairs continued to reflect the light at the wavelength they're currently doing, but they looked like that, we would think they'd change colour. And that's because colour words go along with our experiences. They don't go along with the wavelength of light behind.
Cultures don't even have a word for blue.
Say that again?
A lot of cultures don't have a word for blue.
That's irrelevant. Okay, so in a world in which objects appeared blue to us but reflected light at a different wavelength, we'd still call these objects blue, as you rightly say. So nothing is blue unless normal human beings under normal conditions experience it as blue. So we're not looking at people here who are blind or who are colourblind, and we're not looking at conditions in which you have a light with a bit of blue paper over it or anything like that. Something is blue if a normal human being under normal conditions experiences it as blue.
It is contentious whether people can experience the colour blue as blue, because a lot of people who don't have the word blue use the word green or black to describe the colour blue.
Okay, we're not talking about what they call it. I'm using the word blue as it.
Behind what people are talking about without having the word.
We can't get to the experience behind it. Full stop. I have no idea what you experience when you look at this curtain, but you call it blue. At least you do when you're not trying to be clever.
No, I'm not clever. I'm just saying because you say a normal human being and a normal experience.
But I'm using this in the normal meaning of English of blue. On the contrary, blue is a great example. But anyway, I've got another example, so let's have a look at that one. Science knows that pain in human beings is realised by C fibres and alpha-delta fibres. The firing of these fibres are not the real essence of pain. Okay, so this is a scientific discovery that you might say is the discovery of what pain really is. But actually it's not, because in a world where green lumps appear at the site of human tissue damage and hurt, green lumps would realise pain. It's the hurting that's important. Nothing is pain unless normal human beings experience it as painful, as hurting. It's that experience of hurting, of pain, that makes something pain, not the fact that it's C fibre firing or A delta firing. So, for example, if there are Martians who don't have these physical or to take it into real life, if dogs don't have these fibres, they can still be in pain if they still experience hurt, that something is hurting. So, okay, we've got two different ways of understanding theoretical ideas. There's the real essence model, according to which what science discovers is the nature of these things, like as in water and gold. And then there's the functional definition model, in which what science discovers is not the nature of these things, but the physical realization of these things. So the physical realization of the appearance of blue to normal human beings under normal conditions is it reflects light at 425 nanometers. And the physical realization of pain as it affects human beings is it's the firing of A delta fibres, of C fibres, etc. But physical realization is not the essence or the nature. Okay, do you see the difference between the two types of theoretical idea? Bob and then Dot.
Would I be right in saying that the only time that a functional definition differs from an essence, real essence, is subjective things like pain and blue?
That's awesome.
Or are there any other examples?
Because in the
Well, let me think about the answer to that.
it's the same question.
Oh, okay, go on.
I mean, I was just going to say, so like, because in the real essence, you use examples that are purely scientific, or sorry, are material objects.
Yeah, no,
And in the functional definition, you're using
human
say,
experiences.
human experience. So
Yeah.
Is there an example of the opposite? Is there something that's a human experience that could?
That's a really interesting question, and one thing I hate doing when I'm actually giving a lecture is actually thinking. And I wish I'd done this thinking, because that's a very good question, because it would have been... can anyone think of a functional definition of something that doesn't involve human experience? No, can I perhaps answer that question next week when I've given it some thought? Because I'd have to think on my feet now, and it's hard to do that and finish a lecture at the same time. Sorry, now I can't stop thinking. No, I must stop thinking. Okay, so two definitions of a theoretical idea. One is something that lies behind but isn't the nature, and the other is something that lies behind and is the nature. Okay, so we're asking now, is causation more like water and gold? In other words, if science discovers something that lies behind, is what it discovers the real essence of causation? Or is causation more like blue and pain, in that what it discovers is not the real essence of causation, but the physical realization of the nominal essence, if you like, of our experiences of causation? That's why it's interesting. But I'm not thinking about it. Okay, so is causation more like water and gold, or more like blue and pain? Okay, if it's more like water and gold, then regularity is nothing more than the nominal essence of causation. Okay, regularity is the way we recognize causation. It's not itself causation. Okay. To discover the real essence of causation will be to discover... so if science discovers the real essence of causation in this world, what it'll have discovered is the nature of causation in every world. If we believe that causation has a real essence, then we think that it's going to have the same real essence in every possible world. So if we think that we're discovering the real essence of causation, what we're discovering is something with modal import, something that has ramifications for our beliefs about necessary worlds and possible worlds. To discover the real essence of causation in this world will be to discover that in every possible world, that's what causation is, because that's the nature of causation. And that's a very, very strong claim. If causation is... whoops, okay. So do you see that that's a very strong claim? Because you're making a claim not just about this world, not just about what causation is in this world, but a claim about what causation is in every possible world. And in fact, actually, Strawson denies that if we found the real essence in this world, we would therefore have found the real essence in every possible world. If causation is more like blue and pain, then it's not that it's what the causation is what lies beneath regularity, it's the regularity that's essential to causation, and what lies beneath may be what realizes causation, realises regularities in this world, even if we discover there is a relation underpinning the regularity, this relation will not be causation in the same way that sea fibre firing is not pain. It's not the nature of pain, it's just what realises pain in human beings. And Martian pain may be realised by something completely different. So this relation won't be causation. Causation could be realised by a different physical relation in every possible world. So what we'd be discovering would merely realise causation in this world. It doesn't have the same modal implications as the real essence view does. So in other words, causation might be realised by a different relation. So if you go for the functional definition thing, you're saying that causation could be multiply realised, that regularity might be realised by this relation, this physical relation in this world, but this physical relation in this world. So, do you think there's a power or force that underpins regularities in this and every other world? If so, then you think that causation is like water and pain. Not pain.
Blue.
Gold.
Gold.
Gold. Okay, gold. In that it has a scientifically discoverable, it's real essence. And in that case, you're likely to reject reductive realism and accept a singularist theory of causation. Okay. Most philosophers reject this. Even if they believe that science will one day discover a force, power, or necessary connection underpinning the regularities in this world, they believe that in other worlds, regularities might be underpinned by different forces, powers, or connections.
Hang on, would they be the same regularities?
Well, they might be, whatever the regularities are in that world. Yes, they might be the same as this one, but actually, again, we might think they might be different. Okay, or do you think that there might be one relation, or more, because there might be different types of causation in this world, underpinning regularities in this world and different relations in other worlds? If so, then you think that regularity is essential to causation and that any relation underpinning it is merely a realisation of causation in this world, not the very nature of causation, in which case you're likely to be happy with reductive realism and reject singularist theories of causation. Okay, that's finished the discussion of reason 1. I'm going to look very quickly at reason 2 and I'll remind you what that is first. But any questions about reason 1? Dot.
I just wanted to come back to that thing we were talking about before. I just wonder if there's a possibility there is some sort of category mistake being made here, or potentially if all your examples about essence
Involve experience.
all
Not
real
essence, functional definition.
The real essence ones involve materialistic things in the world, and all the ones that
Functional definition.
functional definition all seem to talk about experience. So it then comes down to whether or not you think that causation is a thing in the real world, or whether it's something that we experience, surely.
Well, that is, if the functional definition is going to leave causation as being the regularity that we observe. So yes, indeed, it will bring in much more of the human experience than it would do if it was something that had a real essence. Because the real essence of gold is nothing at all to do with us. Whereas the real essence of blue is, as you say, very importantly to do with an experience that normal human beings have under normal experiences.
Because causation isn't the same
conditions,
type of
rather.
thing as water or gold.
Well, no, let's not beg the question, but yes, that's possible. Yep. Okay, so let's have a look at reason 2. If you remember reason 2, so Strawson gave 2 reasons for thinking that Hume would not have denied the existence of necessary connection. The first was that it's part of our ordinary idea of causation. The second was because he thinks it's implausible to deny the existence of necessary connection. So Strawson thinks that it's just absurd to think that there's no reason for the regularities that we observe, that there could be these regularities and yet nothing that lies behind them. Just absurd, so he says. And Hume's not stupid. Hume wouldn't have thought something so patently, obviously stupid. And actually, again, we can sympathise with this view, I think. I remember as an undergraduate suddenly realising what was meant by the regularity view, i.e. that causation didn't really exist, which isn't how you should put it, but that's what I put it as myself, that there is no necessary connection, there is no force or power behind the regularities. And I thought it was absurd. And you might have had the same idea. I mean, from a few of your questions in the first week, I think you were having the same trouble there. So Strawson would agree with you if you had that intuition. Absurd to think that there can be these regularities and yet no explanation of them. But philosophers, on the whole, haven't gone along with this. So Helen Beebe says, appealing to necessary connection is a bit like appealing to destiny or a conspiracy. It does no work. It's a loose cog. So when so something happens. Michael and I have this happen, and we think, you know, it turns out that his wife is my sister's. Well, you know, that sort of coincidence. And we say, oh, it must be destiny. Now, destiny is just, we don't really believe that there's a force called destiny, do we? We just think, you know, here's a very strange coincidence. And we appeal to it. But we actually aren't doing any explanatory work, are we, in appealing to it? And conspiracy theorists are also... Have you ever had a conversation with somebody who is absolutely sure that Diana was taken out by... it doesn't matter what evidence you give or what, you know, you say, well, can you imagine the machinery that must have been behind hiding this or something? There's an explanation for it, always. Because somebody who believes in a conspiracy theory always has an answer to anything you're going to say. That's what a conspiracy theory is. And if you think that Diana was taken out by Prince Philip, please don't engage me in conversation afterwards. But can you see it's a loose cog, it does no work. And Helen Beebe is saying that a necessary connection is exactly the same. If science looks and finds a necessary connection, it's not going to tell us anything. A bit like David, you were saying, you think here, you know, this is not something for which you're going to need glasses. This is like thinking further. You go down to the next level, you go down to the next level, you go down to the next level. It's regularity all the way down. And the philosopher Simon Blackburn says there isn't any straitjacket on nature. It's always possible that the future is not going to be like the past. There's nothing that guarantees that the future will be like the past. There's nothing that guarantees that the next time one billiard ball hits another, the other won't turn purple and spiral off into the heavens. And therefore there isn't any necessary connection of this kind.
Isn't that just a bald assertion?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I sort of wonder a bit about that. I prefer Helen Beebe's answer. But I think this is really interesting, and if you look at the handouts, you can make your own mind up by reading these. But I have some sympathy with your claim that it might be just a bald assertion there.
Do you not believe in like universal constants and stuff like that? Or claims, you know, like surely one has to only recourse to, you know, the laws of nature, and then say
yes, but if the laws of nature are read on the Mill-Ramsey-Lewis model, that doesn't give you a necessary connection either. Okay, so both these philosophers think that we should stick with RTC, or actually more likely CTC, because that gives us much more of a feel that there is less of a gap between the ordinary understanding of causation and causation itself, because if we can say, had C not occurred, E would not have occurred, that gives us a type of feeling of force. But both believe that the only possible evidence we can have for causation is going to consist in regularity, and that there's little point, therefore, in insisting that causation is really something else, some force or power or necessary connection.
Doesn't that leave us with a problem of this?
Well, can I just finish, and then we can go to questions. So
Just go back to the last page. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so there are philosophers, though, who believe that we can find an empirical account of causation. This is going to be an account of causation in this world. It won't be an account of the nature of causation. And next week we're going to look at the views of these philosophers, the views of people who believe that we can find a physical force or power in this world that we can say is causation, a bit in the way that people will say that reflecting light at 425 nanometers is blue. Because, of course, there happens to be a correlation between something's appearing blue to normal human beings under normal circumstances in this world and it's reflecting light at 425. So actually there's no empirical difference in saying that they're the same thing. It's only philosophers who get very uptight about that sort of thing. Okay, so next week we're going to look at the view, except that it's not next week. It's the week after, as you know. I thought that aside. Okay, so let's do a quick summary of this week. So we looked at a new interpretation of Hume as a sceptical realist, as opposed to a reductive realist. We looked at singularist theories of causation, which insist that causation is a force or power or necessary connection. We looked at Strawson's argument for the new interpretation, which involves distinguishing between representative ideas and relative ideas, giving us the idea of a theoretical concept or a theoretical idea. We looked at an ambiguity in the new interpretation. When we're talking about theoretical ideas, are we talking about ideas of a real essence, or are we talking about ideas of a physical, functional definition? And we had a look at why the real essence thing, because it has modal implications, is problematic, whereas the functional definition doesn't have modal implications and is maybe less problematic for that fact, but also means that we can't really say that causation is this force or power or necessary connection, just that it's realised in this world by this scientifically discoverable force or power or necessary connection. And that's the slide that I thought was coming up last time. Okay, so there's no lecture next week. I'm now told that this is no longer necessary because there was going to be something in this room that's no longer booked, so it could have been next week. But sadly, I'm going to London, so I'll see you again on the 18th of November. And we've got a quarter of an hour for questions. If you've got any questions. Say it again?
Shall I give these out now?
No, not yet. No. Sean?
There was a point one of your philosophers made about there's no reason to think that the future will be always the same as the past.
Simon Blackburn.
That's fair enough. So if we watch billiard balls bouncing off each other, we're only assuming in terms of regularity that the next one will so do the same. But it's only a probability. Only a probability. Whether we drop a book or we let go of a book and it drops to the floor, there's no guarantee it will next time.
Yep.
If it doesn't, then there should be a reason, a detectable reason, whatever that may be. And so there is no conflict here with the idea, to my mind, of causation.
Well,
definition. I do not have to think
no.
all that.
Don't forget Simon Blackburn's giving a reason for its being more like you've just described. So a necessary connection between A and B means that if A occurs, B must occur. Okay, that there's a necessary, and you're just pointing out exactly what Simon Blackburn's pointing out is nonsense. There's no must about it. It's much more of a case of probability or whatever. And because there's no must about it, why should we want to postulate a necessary connection? So you're saying exactly what Simon Blackburn is saying.
So when you had there was a sort of sequence of arguments. If I believed X, then I'd have to believe Y. There was a sort of, on the 2 or 3 slides that said, if I start from one particular premise, then the following argument would be necessary. Well, I don't want to use the word necessarily.
Quite right. You see, I know I'm doing something right when I get a student who says, "Oh, I don't want to use the word necessarily." That one?
I think it was the one before that. If you, yes,
This one.
yes. If I think something, then I must think something else. Yes, I could have asked you to hold back those points. I wanted to see those arguments, but they're on your handouts, aren't they?
Yeah. Either they or a reference to
Yes, indeed.
them will be on. So the idea is that if you think that there's a necessary connection, then you're saying that causation has a real essence, and that if A causes B, there's a force that ensures that if A occurs, B must occur.
So at that point, I apply Occam's razor. I don't need it.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what Helen Beebe and Simon Blackburn are doing. They're saying, why are we postulating this necessary connection? We don't need it.
Thank you.
David and then Mike.
Why don't we go the whole hog and just dispense with causation itself, and just regard it, instead of the cement of the universe, as just a sort of lubricant for the sake of ease of talking about the universe, and instead just talk about the nature of things?
I think you'd find, well, Russell would agree with you there. He has a lovely quote that I'm not going to be able to remember. It's something like, causation is a bit like the monarchy. It plays no role at all in anything that we do.
Well, I was going to say,
let's get rid of it.
MPs who go and seek membership for the Chiltern Hundreds, which is a fiction, but it's convenient.
Yes, but notice we have the word, the Chiltern Hundreds, for it. And even if causation, I mean, trying to imagine doing without the concept of causation just gives me the screaming heebie-jeebies. How do we get rid of the idea of causation?
Oh, billiard balls are the sort of things that when they bump into each other, one causes the other. The other move.
I knew he would do that.
The other move is because they're round, solid, and all that.
Because. I mean, you can't get rid of.
No, observation just confirms that to be the case.
No, but the because is an appeal to causation. A because B. Yeah, honestly, you can try it if you like, but I think you'd have a real problem with getting rid of it.
Substitute and for because.
Oh, now, okay. We're going to do a bit of logic here. So anyone who remembers their truth tables, let's do A and B. Oops. A and B. Okay, so in the world where A is true and B is true, is A and B true?
Yeah.
Yeah. In the world where A is true and B is false, is A and B true or false? False. In the world where A is false and B is true, is A and B true or false?
False.
False. And in the world where A is false and B is false, is A and B true or false? False. Okay, good. So we see that and is truth functional. Okay, the truth of A and B is always going to be a function of the truth of A and the truth of B. Now let's try A because B. So true, 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 false, true, false, true, true, false, false. Okay, in the world where A is true and B is true, is A because B true? In the world where A is true and B is true, is the world the sentence A because B true? Or do we not know?
You don't know.
We don't know. Okay, in the world where A is true and B is false, is A because B true or false? It must be false. Okay, in the world where A is false and B is true, is A because B true? Where A is false and B is true, is A because B true?
I think that's
If we don't know.
It's,
Or false.
yeah, it's either false or we don't know. And what about when they're both false?
It must be.
I think that's indeterminate.
I'm confused.
We probably, well, if A because B implies that A is true, then that's going to be false too. But the fact is we've got a question mark in there. The truth of A because B depends on more than the truth of A and B. And so it's completely different from and, has a different meaning.
I wouldn't put that first question mark.
Oh.
I'd say if we knew more about...
Oh, well.
Well, that's what he's saying.
But we didn't need to know anything more here, did we? I mean, here we need to know more than the truth values of A and B in order to give you A because B. You need to know that they're related. I mean, A could be the truth of Marianne's wearing black trousers, and B could be the truth of David's wearing a red sweatshirt. In which case A because B is false, presumably. You don't wear a red sweatshirt every time I wear black trousers, do you? I mean, but if we give a different definition of A and B, we will get it, yes, there is a causal relation there. So because and means something completely different. Sorry, that was I couldn't resist. It's not often I can give a completely tabular example of why somebody's wrong. Sorry, David, you just happened to be it. No, good.
To go back to what David was saying,
Speak up.
One could, I presume, change the language in such a way that whenever, at the moment, we talk about something causing, we could say, whenever something such happens, such and such happens. Whenever A, then B. We could abandon cause and just talk in terms of
regularity.
Regularities. Now, would we lose anything if we did that?
Well, of course, we do know that, I mean, one of the problems for the regularity theory of causation was the fact that there appear to be regularities that are not causal.
But in that case, they're not really that regular. I mean, the reason we know that is because when you actually examine it, you find that it's not...
Well, imagine the situation where every single male in this room happens to be a second son. I mean, and so it's an entirely universal regularity. Every male attending Marianne's lectures is a second son. So it's as regular as you like, but it's still a coincidence.
That's not true of all.
How do we know it?
Well, if it were true of all your lectures, then probably it wouldn't be a coincidence.
It is just possible that it's true of all my lectures that every male attending them is a second son.
Ever.
I still think that it would be a coincidence. I mean, I wouldn't want that regularity to become part of my theory of reality.
Isn't that because you know from experience
that it's very unlikely to be a regularity?
It's just, yeah.
Yep. But the point still stands, which is that you can have regularities that are not causal, that we don't believe are causal. And so we can't just appeal to... There's more to our concept of causation than regularity itself. That's why we introduced talk of laws of nature. Do you remember in the first...
Well, I just don't see the distinction, because all the law of nature is a real heavy research into what's regular and what isn't.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get further than regularity.
It doesn't get further than regularity, but there laws of nature can be derived from our best explanations of the world. So there is a distinction there, but you're right, there's no more to them than regularities.
I'm following on.
Just before you, is there anyone else who hasn't yet asked a question?
But it's not really a question about this particular topic, it's about the relationship between the two of the philosophers you've spoken about in the last week or so, Strawson now and Lewis last week in particular.
David Lewis.
And I was just wondering whether in fact these two people, who presumably represent different schools of thought within philosophy, are popularly supported, or they're marginal, or is one more popular than the other?
Well, that is quite an interesting question, because there's a book called The New Debate about Hume, The New Debate, or something like that. It's on the reading list. And it is interesting, because the old debate of whether causation is nothing more than regularity has been around since Hume himself. The new debate was really introduced by Strawson in 1989. And so the old debate, or the new debate, is gaining some...
But that was after Lewis, right?
That was after Lewis. I mean, Lewis started working on causation started working on counterfactual theories of causation in 1973, or at least that was his big paper. I mean, there are people... There are followers of Strawson and there are followers of Lewis, and I wouldn't like to say who is more popular. And anyway, of course, it's not a popularity contest.
No, but it just shows a regularity in philosophers.
Okay.
So I just wanted to, I know you're running out of time, I just wanted to say I'm kind of confused by this notion of regularity, because on the one hand we're talking about things of natural law, and that's where my kind of sensibility would go. That's the explanation. But you think, well, all of this talk and this constant reference to billiard balls and to inanimate objects that have no minds of their own. Now, I know you said you're going to talk about this in a future lecture, but it seems that a lot of this is predisposed to assume that there's a regularity in everything, or that that even if you see one-off events, I mean, if you see, we were talking about, if you see one-off events, or let's take for example something like telepathy, mind reading. Now there's plenty of examples where people individually
do we have to?
Well, I'm just trying to use an example where it's doubtful about the causality and causation of these things, but you could say certainly that there are examples of people guessing correctly or getting above average scores, or whatever. Now you can't. Do we have to deny that there's? Sorry, I'm getting lost in my own thoughts.
Well,
what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't seem that there's always regularity, and there's a lot of things that don't seem to be regular. Does that mean that we have to discount there being any causal relation because there seems to be no regularity?
Well, that was Bob's point, I think. Yes, I mean, there is some evidence that under certain conditions, some people can mind read. I mean, that they think
just
of a very...
There's no regularity to it, that's why it's been scientifically discredited.
What science is looking at is whether those who say whether there is a regularity between Johnny's thinking or somebody's thinking A or imagining that, and somebody else is being able to tell that that's what they're thinking. I mean, they're looking for regularities because regularities are, whatever else is true, are evidence for causation.
But that's again, but that's.
I mean, without regularities, without scientific evidence of regularity, we tend to say there isn't any causation.
But again, is it question begging or circular, isn't it? Because it's like saying, well, we must, because everything is based on regularity. Well, how do we know everything's based on regularity? Because Hume says everything's based on regularity.
No, it's certainly not because Hume... I mean, Hume says it's based on regularity because it tends to be based on regularity rather than the other way around. Yeah. Anyway, we're going to have to finish there. So, no lecture next week, lecture the week after, and we'll look at a singularist theory of causation, an empirical theory of causation. Actually, we'll look at several.